Hi, this is Chuck Stull, continuing our discussion of the beer industry. Now, we finished our last video uh, with the idea that mainstream U.S. beers, many of them tasted the same. Now, two factors have changed that, and I'd like to look at the first of those in this video. So the rise of horizontal differentiation over the last few decades has been a really important change in the U.S. beer market. Some U.S. consumers have developed a taste for more flavorful beer, for beer that is more malty or more bitter. And this really started at the end of the 20th century with beer imports. Um, so we saw a significant growth in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to about 10% of total beer sales. So that was an 18 times increase in the volume. The imported beer, of course, was more expensive because it needed to cover shipping costs, and partly because of that, it had a premium image and a perception of better quality. But some of the beers were more flavorful. So if we look at a Heineken or Beck's, like the Stella, these are about twice as bitter as the standard US beers. And if we look at something like Guinness, it's even more bitter. So returning to our same chart, we're looking at right, the little cluster of X's, mainstream domestic US beers, the Heineken and Beck's, some of the other um, European beers being a little bit more bitter, a little bit more malty. And then we have Guinness, which is much more bitter, but because it's such a heavy beer, the maltiness balances that out. But again, very, very distinct from the traditional US beers. Now, the market leaders tended to be relatively mild. So most of the beers were coming from Mexico, from Canada, um, and they really fit very, very closely in with those traditional American relatively mild beers. And in fact, most of the excuse me, most of the world's leading beers are lightly flavored pilsners. Now, at the same time, while imports are growing rapidly, both the lighter flavored and some of the more strongly flavored, domestic brewers had introduced a new category, light beer. And this was introduced first by Miller with their light brand that we mentioned earlier, followed by Anheuser-Busch and Coors with Bud Light, Coors Light, and other products. So these are even less malty and less hoppy than the regular domestic beers. If they were in our graph, they'd be even closer towards water. These are um, light beers in every dimension. But let me return to the imports. As we talked about in our very first beer video, many brewers are multinational today. And so there are a lot of beers that have a international origin but are produced locally. So Beck's is a German beer brewed in St. Louis um, for the American market. Foster's is an Australian beer brewed for the U.S. market in Texas. Kirin from Japan, brewed in California. Red Stripe from Jamaica, brewed in Wisconsin. Now, why might that be? People are paying a premium for these imported beers, but this is really the same economics that the national brewers had a half century before, right, in that by producing the beer closer to the market, their transportation costs will be reduced and they can have a higher profit on the beer because they can charge a high price and have lower overall costs. A couple other beers shown on this slide are not imports but are crafts, and we will look at those in our next video. Thanks for listening. This has been Chuck Stull from Kalamazoo College talking about the beer industry, and particularly looking at the rise of imports at the end of the 20th century.